I feel like a pop star in this mic. I've always longed to have one of these microphones. Thanks, Levi. Thank you, John, Wrapped Studio, and thank you to all of you for coming out this morning and listening to me talk. This is a really big deal for me. The theme of empathy is actually a perfect one for me because I use empathy in everything that I do, and I wouldn't do what I do without it. And when I was thinking about this topic and how to really illustrate what it does for me, what empathy does, I felt that I had to start at the beginning. Yes, I'm doing this slideshow as chapters because I'm an author. Thought that'd be clever. And I am going to be also doing a lot of quotes because quotes from people that I really admire, other authors predominantly, have really helped me in my confidence and shaping my own creativity as I work. I love this quote from John Connolly, the writer of the Book of Lost Things. "For in every adult there dwells the child that was, and in every child there lies the adult that will be." This is me as a child. I currently wear many hats, and in this photo I'm juggling two. I am an only child. I grew up with a father who's Mexican American, and my family on that side is from Mexico. And my mom is from Northern California. Her family is from Scotland. So I grew up on the border of Mexico in El Paso, Texas. And I was pretty happy, as you can see in this photo, but also lonely a lot of the time, as most only. Is anyone here an only child? Oh, good, a few of us. So what I did when I was lonely and to entertain myself was I read a lot. Predominantly books about orphans. I had a debilitating fear of being orphaned, so much so that anytime my parents went out of town, which was very rare, I would become physically ill. So I began reading orphan stories as a way to soothe myself and figure out a plan should anything happen, to mentally prepare myself. And the one book that I think stood out more than any of the others was James and the Giant Peach. I had decided that I was going to rescue myself and my cats and my stuffed animals by finding a giant peach, jumping atop it, and flying to New York City. That was my plan. But beyond that book, there was one book more than any other book, and not just as an orphan story, but as a favorite story and a favorite book of mine, that I really learned the most from. And that is a book called Anne of Green Gables, written by L.M. Montgomery over 100 years ago. How many people here have read Anne of Green Gables? Oh, I see hands like triumphantly, enthusiastically going up. It's a fantastic book, and it tells the story of Anne Shirley, a red-headed orphan, an 11-year-old Canadian, and she is an orphan, and she goes to live with a brother and sister on their farm in Prince Edward Island. And what stood out to me most about Anne Shirley was that she was really talkative and really imaginative. And I, as a child, I don't know if you guys can tell now, but I love to talk. And I was really imaginative. And when I read this book, to use one of Anne's phrases, I really felt like I had found a kindred spirit. Because up until that point, I was always getting in trouble at school for daydreaming too much and talking too much. And in Anne, these qualities were positive attributes. And it wasn't until I read this book that I felt like, wow, maybe all these things that I'm always getting in trouble for are actually a good thing. One of my favorite quotes from Anne herself is, "Because when you are imagining, you might as well imagine something worthwhile." I took this to heart and I started writing books. This is my first book, The Human Garbage Can, My Sister. I wrote it when I was 11. As you can tell, it's by Andi Teran, because I thought that sounded more professional as an author. What's interesting about this in regards to empathy is that I wanted to play a character in my book who had a sister, because I really wanted to know what it was like to have a sibling. So I put myself in the role of the narrator, the first-person narrator, and wrote this book about the human garbage can, my sister. I thought it would be interesting to put it in a series to also look more professional. And as you can see, it doesn't fit in with Tina Trouble, Jill Pill, and Frisky Misty. Kind of stands alone. which is also a metaphor for my childhood. And what I loved about going back and looking at this book, which still sits on my dad's office shelf, is that I really was worried about and paid particular mind to form. And I was only 11 when I wrote this, but I grew up around books. My parents are book collectors, and I remember going into my dad's office and pulling a book from the shelf specifically to look at the form. How do I do the quotation marks, and how does everything have to look? And I was meticulous about this because I felt like this book was real. And little did I know that this going to the shelf thing that I did would actually become part of my creative process. I thought drama was when actors cried, but drama is when the audience cries. Aside from writing books and being interested in reading and writing, I didn't want to be a writer. I never thought twice about writing as a career. I always wanted to be an actor. There was something about the stage and standing upon it, blank as it is here, that's quite like a blank page, that it doesn't come to life until somebody has the courage to step out on there and fill it. And I loved the idea. I loved empty stages, and I loved the idea of getting out there and really creating something that was full of life and full of emotion. Because for me, all of the actors that I really admired, this is Daniel Day-Lewis, were actors who followed the method. And it's actually a technique that I started following when I was in high school. I was like, I'm gonna be a Daniel Day-Lewis. I'm going to be a Christian Bale. You know, I really loved Christian Bale. And what that meant was method acting is all about completely embodying a character, feeling everything that this fictional person is feeling in order to deliver a really realistic portrayal of that person to an audience so that an audience can feel something. So I studied all of my favorite actors. It's Ellen Burstyn, also a method actor. And I really thought about what it meant to transform yourself, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and just be. And I had a mantra that I would tell myself before stepping out onto the stage, because I wasn't ever nervous about the stage. I was nervous about that moment right before you step out onto it. And I told myself this mantra, and I tell it to myself today: if you feel it, they will feel it. Simple as that. I took my acting to New York City. And I love this quote from Arthur Haley. It's, "No man can really succeed if he doesn't move away from where he was born." I believe this is particularly true for the writer. Even though I didn't want to be a writer, I felt it important to move away from my home in Texas. I moved away from Austin, where I'd gone to college, to New York City with the hopes of becoming a Broadway actor. A serious Broadway actor, Mamet and Shepard only. That's kind of what I thought for myself. And I decided to live my life because I knew nobody in New York and I had to get a job, and it was really crazy and I was struggling. I decided to live my life in New York City as a gigantic yes. I was going to say yes to every person I met, every experience, every invitation, just yes, yes, yes. And one of the things I did, I love this quote from Eudora Welty, which is, "All serious daring starts from within." I felt like this whole moving itself was a daring thing to do. But I had no idea that a job that I was going to take ended up being a really daring thing that took me even further than I thought I'd be going. I got a job as a concierge in a hotel called the Mercer Hotel, which is down in Soho. And at the time, it was the most exclusive hotel in New York City. And I had to get a job, so I took this one. And we all have odd jobs that we take, and I always thought, you know, I want to do something that's at least interesting, where I'm around interesting people. And what ended up happening is, I don't know if you can see it here, this is actually me, I believe, in this photo, which I found on Google image search. But there's a library and another magazine library over here. And I became the person in charge of the library and the magazine library. And it was really important to me that certain magazines, because in my free time in New York City, I had no money. I would go to Barnes & Noble and I would pull like 15 magazines from their section. I would just sit on the floor in the corner and like go through magazines. That's what I did in my free time. So I was in charge of the magazine rack, and I was always wanting to put the best looking magazines in the front. It was really important to me. And my favorite magazine was a magazine called City. Does anyone know this magazine? few hands. It no longer exists, but City Magazine operated in the building right next door to the Mercer. And I really loved their covers. I thought they were inventive and interesting, and they had great cultural commentary inside the issue. And I really liked the publisher. His name is John McDonald. And he used to come in all the time and say, hey, you know, where are you sending your guests to? What's the cool new restaurant? Or what's the best new Broadway show? And I would just say, yeah, this is good, or that's good. And one day he came in and he said, hey, I'm looking for writers to write culture content. Would you be interested? Do you write? And I just thought to myself, I've never written an article. How could I possibly write for a magazine? Gigantic yes. Yes, I'm interested. So I love this quote by Ray Bradbury, one of my all-time favorite writers. I use it all the time. Jump and you will learn how to unfold your wings as you fall. I decided to jump and take on this job writing articles while I was working at this hotel. And it was the first time I encountered a blank page. And I didn't know what to do. So I said, how do I write this article? It was 50 words on a clothing label. And I went to the shelf, like I did as a child, the magazine shelf at the hotel, and I pulled out Vogue, and I pulled out Vanity Fair, and I pulled out The New Yorker, and I looked at how articles were written, and I just kind of mimicked that. And I remember turning in my first article, and it came back with nothing but red marks from my editor, and I had to rewrite it. And my ego was really bruised because I'd worked so hard, and I'd done all this research, and God, it's good, and how could this possibly be all red? And what I found was I continued to keep getting red marks, and they continued to keep giving me assignments because I was passionate about what I was doing, and I wanted to get better. And I learned that every failure that I got was actually knowledge. And it was teaching me to be a better writer. Those 50-word pieces turned into 100-word pieces, turned into 200-word pieces, turned into my own column. I ended up being given the back page of the magazine, which is called the icon page, and I wrote about iconic products and places and things. And I did this all while still working at the hotel. It's also interesting to note that I was trying to do plays at night and juggle all of these different things, and I think really what I was doing more than anything was playing the part of a concierge who was also pretending to be a writer. And one of the great things about working at the Mercer was I was exposed to really incredible creative people, many of whom were my heroes. One of my biggest heroes was a man by the name of Anthony Minghella. Anthony Minghella. Does anyone know Anthony Minghella? He's the writer-director of The English Patient, Cold Mountain, The Talented Mr. Ripley, a fantastic film, and this one, Truly, Madly, Deeply, which was one of my all-time favorite films. As you can see from the poster, it is the thinking person's ghost, which I think is a pretty apt description. It's Alan Rickman and Juliet Stevenson, and it's a fantastic movie. And what's so great about it is the writing. It's simple, it's to the point. It's about a woman who loses the love of her life and what she goes through in the aftermath. And Juliet Stevenson's performance is so raw and so emotional that I would just watch it by myself at home alone in my terrible apartment in New York, and I would cry as she cried. And what I found when I was watching this movie was that I really wanted to know how you did that, not as an actor, but as a writer. How do you write something that makes somebody feel that way, that in turn makes an audience member feel the same thing? I was really intimidated by Mr. Minghella because I admired his work so much. And I never really crossed the line of telling him how much I cared about it. But he came into the hotel all the time, and I became his concierge. And he became my favorite guest. He was a wonderful man, very kind. He was always interested in what anyone had to say. You know, I was this girl from Texas standing behind a front desk, and he really gave me the time of day. He really cared. And on his last day at the hotel, and I knew he wasn't coming back for a while because he was going to shoot Cold Mountain, I worked up the courage and I said, you know, Mr. Minghella, I'm a really big fan of your work. And he kind of nodded his head, and I said, Truly, Madly, Deeply, that scene, it just meant so much to me. And he kind of nodded his head. And I said, I want to learn how to write in order to make people feel. How do you do that? And he just looked at me. I remember he looked me right in the eye and he said, you know, I watch you at this desk every day, and you work really, really hard. And you need to take that work ethic, get out of this hotel, and go and do it. I believe in you. And it was those 3 words of I believe in you that changed my life. Those who write are writers. Those who wait are waiters. I love this quote. I took Mr. Minghela's encouragement to heart, and I quit my job at the hotel. And I said, I'm really going to give this a go. I'm going to try and become a writer. What this meant was I became cubicle girl. I took a lot of odd jobs that allowed me to write in secret while I was there, where my boss wouldn't notice or where I had downtime. And I kept writing. I kept writing for City, and I started to put myself out there a little bit. A couple of my friends were starting a new website called Refinery 29, and they said, why don't you be one of our first writers? One of my assignments that they gave me was an interview. And it was something that I always wanted to do, was interview people, because that's about getting into somebody else's head, kind of like getting into a character's head and then telling that person's story to an audience. So my first assignment was to interview two young female designers, two sisters in Los Angeles who created a label called Rodarte. And that was my first interview. And I kept going and trying to do the writer thing, and I still was stuck in this cubicle until I got a phone call one day from a friend of mine who was working in the editorial department at Vanity Fair. And he said, have you heard the news? And I'm sitting at my desk. My boss is going to walk in at any moment. And he said, have you heard the news? And I said, no, what happened? And he said, Anthony Minghella passed away. And I took a moment, and I was really overwhelmed with sadness. It makes me sad thinking about it now. This man meant so much to me. And how can you think, somebody that you don't know, how can they mean so much to you in a way that you're overwhelmed by their death when you don't know them? But I was overwhelmed. And he said, so the thing is, we need someone to write an obituary. I told them that I had a friend who was a writer who knew him. And yeah, an editor's going to call you in 5 minutes. You're going to have an assignment. My sadness turned into this. Literally this. Because Vanity Fair is Vanity Fair. And I didn't think I was ready for this. I would never put myself out there. I would never pitch to Vanity Fair. I didn't think I was ready. So I sat there, like hemming and hawing, thinking, oh my God, the phone rings. It's an editor. He says, yeah, so, I hear you know Anthony Minghella, you worked at a hotel, yada, yada, yada. I need an article. I need 100 to 200 words, and I need it in 2 hours tops. So I said, yes, and I jumped. And I hung up the phone, and I had a blank screen in front of me. And I said, how in the hell do I do this? How do I describe everything that I'm feeling? How do I write this for a Vanity Fair audience? What do I do? And I remembered the words, if you feel it, they will feel it. So I sat down and I just stopped thinking, and I started feeling, and I just started writing. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I wrote over 750 words. And my boss walked in, and my deadline was up, and I hit send. And I waited, and I tried not to think about it, and I got a phone call a few minutes later from the editor, and he said, I just want to let you know, I hope it's okay with you, I changed 2 words. We're going to run it in its entirety. Would you like a job? Did not expect that. And what happened was I immediately got a shot of confidence. And I started writing for Vanity Fair as a freelancer. I quit that desk job, and they started giving me assignments. And the red notes came back again from my editor, and they were even more so than the beginning. And what was so great about it was that I had a defense against it. I knew that those red marks needed to be met with excitement and joy, because red meant knowledge. And I had to get better. And I got better, and I got better, and I got better, and I started pitching. And I started getting jobs at Vogue, at the Paris Review, at MTV. I started pitching to anyone and everyone because it didn't matter to me. I had to say yes, and I had to jump. There was no other way that was going to get me to the next point in my career. And what was great was that I kept saying, I'd really like to do interviews. I love doing interviews. I love talking to people, getting in other people's skin, and telling their stories. How can I do that? New York Magazine answered, and they gave me an interview with one of my biggest heroes, Mr. David Lynch. And I learned so much from that interview of sitting down and just listening to somebody, because that was the biggest thing. I would go back and I would listen to my playback of my notes when I had done interviews, and I was talking all the time. all the time. I wasn't letting the other person talk. And it was difficult going back and transcribing my work because I wasn't getting what I needed from that person. So when I sat down with Mr. Lynch, and it's very easy to do with a transcendental meditation person, I just listened to him. I let him speak. And this interview changed my life again. And I thought a lot about his creativity and the creativity of telling a story, of somebody's story. And it really made me start to think about my own creativity and how I really wasn't doing really what I wanted to do. I was getting there, but I wasn't quite there. So that brings me to fiction. Good fiction creates empathy. A novel takes you somewhere and asks you to live another life. I kind of had always been writing fiction in secret, but I, again, didn't take myself very seriously. But I knew that it was something that I really wanted to pursue. And I was feeling hemmed in by New York City. How many people here have lived in New York City before? A lot of us. So you probably understand this, as cliche as it sounds, but I would come out to LA to work, or for work all the time, and I was just inspired. I was mesmerized by the mountains with coyotes and the sprawling metropolis and the clean air sometimes and the ocean and hiking and, clean food and salads and like all of these things that seem so foreign in New York City. But it really inspired me. And I decided that if I really wanted to pursue this next dream, which was writing fiction, that I needed to move to Los Angeles. Something about LA was calling me. And beyond that, I love the literary tradition of Los Angeles. It's big. We don't talk about this enough. Some of the best books in American literature were written right in this city. Two of my favorites are Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion, which is a beautiful book about Los Angeles in the 1960s, and this book called Weetzie Bat by Francesca Lia Block. How many people have read Weetzie Bat? Somebody's clapping in the back. Yes. This book is fantastic. It's written during the AIDS crisis in the 90s, late 80s punk. It's a young adult novel that is the first crossover novel of its time, I think, because it reads well for adults and for young adults. I was obsessed with that book and with Play It As It Lays, and I said, if I could get out to LA, maybe I could really start working. And a friend of mine, also a writer, was the only person I told that I was kind of writing fiction in secret. And it ended up I was telling the right person this secret because she was a writer herself, and she had a meeting with Penguin Books. They were looking for someone to modernize a classic novel, and she called me up and she said, I don't think I'm right for this. I think you're right for this. Why don't you take my meeting? I said yes. I jumped, and I met with Penguin, and the book they were wanting to modernize was Anne of Green Gables. I knew this book inside and out. Their concept for it was not at all what I thought this book should be. And I was very bold in a way that I never have been before. And I said, I don't like that idea. I have a better one. Will you give me the chance to just write 2 chapters and show you my version? This guy was like, pretty much, thanks but no thanks about me. He took the meeting to be nice to my friend. And he said, you're very passionate. And you seem really nice. Sure, why don't you go ahead and write the first couple chapters? Turn it in a couple of weeks. Just going to let you know, don't get your hopes up. We're really looking for a published author, someone who really writes. So I went home and I wrote more than I've ever written in my life at that point. And I turned in these 2 chapters that, to me, were the beginning of my writing career. Even if I didn't get a book deal, I knew that I could do it, because I felt something. This character, Ana Cortez, this 15-year-old orphan who grew up in Boyle Heights, landed onto the page and existed. And if Penguin didn't say yes, I was going to say yes and do something about it. A couple months later, I'd forgotten about it, kind of, and I got a phone call the day after my birthday from the man from Penguin, and he said, are you sitting down? I was. And he said, I gave your pages to 5 different editors at Penguin. We would like to publish your novel. And I had no agent, and I didn't know how to write a novel. And I said, yes. And I was faced with the biggest blank page I've ever faced in my life. And this quote from a writer I love, Andi. Ideas usually come not at my desk writing, but in the midst of living. I knew I had to find the rest of this story, so I went on a road trip all the way up to Northern California, to the Redwoods in Humboldt County. And I landed in this town called Ferndale, which was on the Lost Coast, if anyone knows it. It's full of Victorian mansions and this pristine coastland that no one is ever on. No one knows about this. It's not on a thoroughfare. You have to get off the road and go to it. And I know instantaneously, I knew that this is where my character, Anna, was going to end up. And I went to these forests with strange anthropomorphic trees and this coastline that was just inspiring. And I remembered the words of Stephen King: if a book is not alive in the writer's mind, it is as dead as year-old horseshit. Stephen King, incidentally, has written the best book, I think, ever on writing. It's called On Writing. You should check it out if you're interested in writing. And I came back to my blank page, and I stared at this blank page for days, which turned into weeks, which turned into months. And my deadline was a few months away, and I had 22 chapters to turn in. And I didn't know what to do. And I came across this quote: "Work finally begins when the fear of doing nothing exceeds the fear of doing it badly." And I started writing. And I went back to the people who came before me, to Hemingway, who told me, "You must be prepared to work always without applause." And I worked really hard every day, every night, with zero applause, knowing that I had to get to the end. And I thought about Henry Miller. Like every man, I am my own worst enemy, but unlike most men, I know too that I am my own savior. And I'd write something that I thought was great one day, and I'd wake up the next morning and think it was terrible. And the only person who could save that was me. And I thought about Nick Cave, one of my biggest muses, talking about the muse. Most people wait for the muse to turn up. That's terribly unreliable. I have to sit down and pursue the muse by attempting to work. I didn't really have a muse. I just had to keep going. And what I found was really interesting in thinking about Nick Cave was I started to put on music, specifically instrumental music by a man named Dustin O'Halloran, who writes piano, beautiful piano pieces. And this world started to come to life, and the more that I worked and the harder that I worked, the easier the work came, the easier the work became. And a muse showed up for me in the form of my grandma, my abuela, my Mexican grandma. And I don't know why she showed up in my mind. I was at a stopping point in my book. I couldn't go any further. And I realized that Anna, my main character, needed a grandma to guide her through the rest of her story. So I created this character. I called my editor, and she said, "I love it. Keep going." I love this quote from Joan Didion. It's often used. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't know this quote. I hear it all the time. There was an article written about it recently. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. I realized in the midst of all of this that I had always lived within stories, that stories were everything to me, that they had brought me to this moment, and that if I kept going and kept going, the only way I would ever fail is if I stopped. And I got to another blank page, the most beautiful blank page I've ever seen, and it was the end page. This is what it looks like when you get your box of books for the first time. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm crying. Like, I'm sobbing in this photo. There is nothing like this feeling. And when I held my book for the first time and I really looked at it, it meant not only that I had done all of this work that was very difficult for this writing of this novel, but that I had done all of this work that was difficult my whole life. That it was all leading up to this moment, and that it was all contained within those pages. There was something so powerful and magical about that. I still look at this cover and it gives me chills. I can't believe this book exists, but it does, and I'm really proud of it. I was at a library in Downey, California on Monday because I'm at the end of my book tour, and it was a room full of people, the first room full of people who had all read the book, and they had had a discussion on Friday before I showed up, and I was so nervous. I thought, oh my God, like, these people have actually read it. And I talked to everybody afterwards, and it was an amazing experience. And this woman came up to me with her daughter, and she said, that chapter about Anna, when she really goes and does this amazing thing, I'm not going to give it away because I want you to buy the book. But she said, that moment in chapter 7, it really made me feel this. And it was the exact thing that I felt when I was writing it. And I thought that that was amazing because I sat down and I really struggled. But I told myself, if you feel it, they will feel it. If you put yourself in somebody else's shoes and really be there and really think about that person and think about that audience, that maybe somebody else will think about what you're thinking about too. So to end the talk, I want to thank you all for being here today, because standing in front of all of you even makes it more real. And talking about a blank page, I know most of us who work in creative fields face blank pages every day. And the way that I really combated that was by learning to love the blank page and not be afraid of it. Because now I know that that first blank page will finally end in an ending blank page. And that's the best page to work towards. So I want to say thank you to everyone today for coming.